Mark.
Entonces, saludos desde la Fundación de
Yes, greetings from the Forensic Anthropology Foundation in Guatemala, here in Guatemala City in Central America, and welcome to this panel called Persistent Challenges in Creating and Maintaining Digital Archives. My name is Mark Truan, and during the next hour, we are proposing two lines of thought based on one main question on maintaining digital archives, be they public or private, and also one additional question, more specific question on public access to files containing personal or delicate information. Both questions are directed at the three participants in the panel, who will have a maximum of 15 minutes to reply, to answer both questions. Juliana Miranda is a sociologist from the Democratic Security Center of Studies, or the CELS, in Argentina. The CELS has gathered an archive, has gathered documents since 1964 to date, to current times. Anton Vecheradze, who will hopefully be connecting very soon, is the Director of Studies for Memory and Misinformation at the IDFI in the Republic of Georgia. He has worked with archives from former Soviet republics from Belarus, Georgia, and Ukraine. And our third panelist is Carlos Juarez. He is an attorney in human rights and is co-responsible for the IGAM archive in Guatemala, together with the universities of Harvard and Delaware in the United States. So the two questions for our panelists today is, well, the first one is, what have been some of the main challenges that you have faced at your organizations in maintaining, protecting, and or using digital archives as pertaining to human rights violations in your part of the world? That question is more broad in terms of the work you've been doing with your respective archives. And then the second question is more specific. And it touches on subjects that we have addressed somewhat by Nisei previously, as far as public access to photos, for example, at the museum in Cambodia. Suleiman also spoke of the matter of confidentiality, and Ivan also spoke recently of levels of access to information. So the second question specifically is, how have you been able to resolve or consider the issue of public access to delicate content, to sensitive content, having to do with human rights violations in the past or in the present? For example, personal information on the victims, information on their family members, and or the means used to research and clarify the events around human rights violations that your archives document. So we would begin with Juliana, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mark. Gracias. I will try to do my presentation in English so that people can understand me. First of all, thank you to PILPG and Sarah and Bethany for inviting us to this conversation. It's nice to see some familiar faces. I would like to tell you a little bit more to start about CELS and what Mark was saying about its role and what CELS is and its role in documenting. CELS was founded during the last dictatorship in Argentina, so I can definitely relate to what Leland was saying about showing to new generations archives and documentation on human rights violations that were not very recent. And CELS had a prominent and a key role in providing documentation to support the justice processes for the crimes committed during the dictatorship. And in 1983, when democracy was restored in Argentina, CELS started asking a new question about what were the similarities and the differences between state violence during the dictatorship and post-dictatorship. What kind of police brutality was happening then, and what were the continuities or the ruptures with other state and political violence. Firstly, I will refer specifically to CEL's work in documenting police brutality, even though we have other archives. The points I will raise today have to do mostly with our database on police brutality. So one of the main challenges, I believe, has to do with the lack of official state-produced information on this matter, on this issue, which is something that was very true in 1993 and is very true still today, 25 years later. No, more than 25 years later. The database records incidents from 1996, so the database is 25 years old today. And I think that the fact that the state does not produce information about police brutality shows tolerance. It shows tolerance for these human rights violations to keep occurring. And there's no interest in knowing the phenomenon that we need to control. And I think this lack of data combines with one of the main challenges that CELS, and I assume that other organizations around the world also face, which is regressive approaches to security. In Argentina, this makes the results of the use of this information somewhat limited in regard to advocacy and public policy, because we can highlight a problem, but authorities don't wish to see it. And most often public opinion is also not on our side. So those would be the first challenges that I would like to highlight. So in this scenario, CEL starts to collect information from 4 major newspapers in Argentina as a primary source. So we collect information on cases of police brutality that have been published in the newspapers. The scope of the database records events with civilians that have been killed or injured, and participation of at least one security agent in all of the territory of Argentina. And one second challenge regarding working with newspaper articles has to do with underreporting of cases, especially when it comes to non-lethal violence, when it comes to cases in rural areas that tend not to be published in the papers, and also cases of torture, both in prisons and police stations, as well as in neighborhoods and what we call here shanty towns and marginalized areas. Another problem with working with newspaper articles has to do with the fact that they almost always account for the police version of the incident and not for the families or the victims' version. And that is something that we keep in mind very often. Most often, there's a lot of data missing from the event that allows us to signal out the perpetrator. So the full name of the police agent that perpetrated the violence is most often not published for protection. Also, other data can be missing, like the full name and the age of the victims. And this presents certain obstacles for using this information, as we know that they understate the phenomenon that we are trying to make visible, that the stories told in the papers are not always trustworthy, and that sometimes we cannot address the questions and consultations that we receive because they relate to data that we don't have. For example, the track record of a specific perpetrator. A third challenge that I would like to highlight has to do with what I was saying before, the length of the database. This database records over 11,000 incidents, many of which have multiple newspaper articles associated with them. And we keep record of all of them since 1996. So this generates a substantial volume of historical, first physical archives and now digital archives, that we have struggled really to digitalize individually. It was a lot of paper, mostly, that we had to digitalize manually. And that takes a lot of space in our servers, which are not really maybe most updated, and that we still haven't managed to collate and to organize these digitalized archives completely. These are PDF files, basically. And we still haven't managed to completely systematize all of these records that we keep. Mostly because of a lack of manpower, so to speak, and also financial support to carry out this task. This is a very important problem in human rights organizations in Argentina. And this has resulted in, for example, the fact that we cannot yet make these archives accessible to the public. So we can't open these newspaper articles that we have kept for over 25 years to researchers, journalists, students, or other NGOs. A fourth challenge associated with this has to do with the number and the rotation of people who have worked with the database over these 25 years, which is a really long period. And this is something that I remember also came up in other panels organized by PILPG. I think it's something that's very common to human rights organizations, that we depend on volunteers to do a lot of work, and that while we keep guidelines on how to store and keep these records organized, it is inevitable that different criteria intervene over the years, and this can produce certain disarrangement in the records. Also because, like I said, the work is mostly carried out by volunteers who are mostly students in our case and who rotate every semester or two. So we have to keep training constantly these volunteers, and the supervision of how the database and its archives are maintained has to be very strict. And I think this also presents a fifth challenge related to the security of information, and like Ivan was saying before, and I think it's something that's also very common to our organizations and to our archiving work, and the level of access that each person is given to these records. I mean, these volunteers are not a permanent part of our staff, and we have not yet had, to my knowledge, any breach in security of our archives, nor on the database. We are now under a project that we're working on with the engine room. We migrated the software from something that was very old, obviously, as a database, and was custom made, to using UWASI, which is a tool that was developed by Huridox. And so now all of our records and all of our incidents with their sources are in the process of being migrated to that online platform. So I think that now we are working from home. I haven't been to the office in over a year. And I think that also represents certain challenges regarding the digital clouds that these servers are stored in and are being accessed in different locations all over the city, rather than in a local server, which is how they were usually stored. So I think that provided a bit more security with backups and all of that procedures in line, of course. And now, since we are working from home, all of our materials have to be accessible remotely. And I think also that poses certain challenges, which we are facing right now. And I think we are still in the process of resolving. Finally, with regard to the question about personal information, CELS, like I said, records information that has already been published in newspapers. So this has not been a major concern within the life of the database. However, we are very conscious of the information that we give out, and very mindful that these newspapers don't represent reality. So whenever possible, we do try to cross-check all the information with government officials or with the justice system where there is an investigation ongoing. And we keep our records updated, so with the latest known facts of the event, so that we don't contribute to spreading incorrect information. That said, the database is not publicly accessible at the moment. We only display statistical information on our website that is already processed. And to access more specific records or more specific information about a singular event or a group of cases, for example, cases that happened in 1 year or in one location, one would have to get in touch with CELS staff, that would be me, and initiate a conversation as to what the uses of the information will be, which variables or levels of aggregation are required and why, etc. We are always very clear about the limitations of the information when we interact with consultants, and we also touch on the missing data, so that we make clear that there's information that is missing because we are working with newspapers and that has certain limitations. And overall, I think that what we try to do is to minimize the opportunities for misinterpretation of the information, because processing information with a lot of missing data can lead to wrong conclusions, and we try also to avoid that. So, which is why in our website, we only collate, thank you, Mark. We only collate certain information. CELS is a human rights organization that is dedicated to advocacy and to litigation and to communication campaigns. And so this information serves all those purposes, or tries to serve all those purposes. So we are very cautious of what information we publish. And so far, this has not been any personal specific details on the events, but rather aggregated data, which is not to say that we actually want to make these records available, sort of like a digital library, so to speak. Not the way that we record or that we categorize or the variables that we use, but the pieces of news that have been digitized so that people can reprocess them or make their own research or use them in all different ways, like what I was saying, maybe the pictures or other things that can be used to create audiovisual material in human rights, etc. So we are in the process of thinking about how we're going to do that in the future. And that is some of the challenges that we are facing today. Thank you.
Excelente, muchas gracias, Juliana.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Juliana. We are right on time. Anton, welcome. I understand that you have had much experience in the former Soviet states, together with the archives that today I believe are public. So if you could maybe answer the two questions that we've posed for the panelists today. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for introducing me. How can you hear me? It's okay, this sound? Okay, thank you very much. I also prefer to speak in English. Unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish, but I will improve. Mark, do I have a chance to share my screen somehow to follow the presentation? Okay, please give me this access if you can. Okay, yes, I have this access now. Yes, so, and yeah, my presentation is first of all, I want to thank Sites of Conscience and all the organizations involved in this very interesting idea to make a research about our needs and about the principles of digital archiving practices and in what we have a lack of what resources, what should we undertake to make this process more full and complete. And this research was conducted in 3 former Soviet countries, in Georgia, in Ukraine, and in Belarus. It's a little bit far away from South America, but I want to remind you that it's in former Soviet region, so-called the world's biggest empire that was during the 70 years. The Russia was its leader next to the Europe, and unfortunately, as well as Georgia and Ukraine became forcefully became part of this not very good empire, let's say like this, for 70 years, and also Belarus, of course. And we conducted our research in these 3 countries, in Ukraine, Belarus, and Georgia, which share many things in common, but also there are a lot of differences. For example, if Georgia and Ukraine, on the one hand, the official declared policy of our countries is westernization, is integration in European Union, and to establish Western style democracy in our countries. More or less, we are successful in this. We have still a lot to do in this regard. But Belarus is not like this, and with that many organizations and all the Western civilized international organizations, societies, and countries consider that it is ruled still by Soviet-style leader, or even he is called by many of observers as a dictator, Alexander Lukashenko. So democratization process in this country has not started yet. So I want to tell you about our organization. Is one of the leading who is working and advocating openness of state archives in former Soviet countries and Eastern Bloc. For example, in 2019, we made research about the openness of state archives in relevant countries, and there were like 5 big groups of indicators: laws, archival laws, direct archival laws, laws that affect archival openness, for example, law on personal data protection and state secrets, for example, services, website and web services, and reading room according to this survey, openness of state archives vary in different countries. For example, in post-Soviet countries, the Eastern European countries, former Eastern Bloc countries, were the most successful. Lithuania, Latvia, Czech Republic, Poland, and also Ukraine. Ukraine state archives are very open, and they have like 80.8% of openness ranking according to our methodology. Georgia is not very open, let's say like this. It has 70% of openness, and Belarus is a totally closed system of archives, and local researchers and organizations who need some documents from there are in a very bad situation, among with some Asian countries like Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. And according to the survey of the current survey, the current survey very correlates with our openness. And in the countries where openness of archives is higher, local CSOs and organizations, they they are more like they can handle these documents, and help from government towards them is on a higher level, and vice versa. Evaluating organizations, Georgia Institute for Development of Freedom of Information, we mainly focus on Soviet period. We created several databases. In Ukraine, the organization is similar, Center for the Study of Liberation Movement. They also study human rights violations during Soviet political regime, and in Belarus, and you can see upon their request, we are not crediting their name in this study because it may bring problems to them. And they study, as well as Soviet period, also modern time repressions that are still ongoing in this country, in Belarus. In Georgia, and also the volume of materials we have is different. You see the numbers here. Ukraine and Belarusian organizations are bigger than our organization, and it also has its explanation that I will tell you after. So what is the primary focus and objectives of documentation process? Yeah, it's in general, you can see here that in general it's restoration of historical justice, assistance of repressed citizens. For example, we we advocate for improving living subsidy for victims of Soviet regime that is ridiculous in modern day Georgia, and it's like €2 monthly, and it's ridiculous, unfortunately. Also, contribution to open access to the documents which contain information about massive human rights violation, because as I mentioned before, our archive, for example, Georgian archive and Belarusian archive, is not very open until now. And sometimes people who want to conduct research, they address us rather than State Archive and State Ministry of Internal Affairs Archive. And also decommunization process of societies. We not only collect documents, but we are making databases, articles, many interesting audio-visual materials like videos, infographics, etc., to show people who unfortunately in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Belarus still have some nostalgia, they are still nostalgic towards Soviet past, and sometimes you even can hear fantastic things like while Stalin executed several thousand people, he didn't knew about this, and everything was fault of other people. But we showed them that, for example, in Georgian case, 3,600 people were executed by direct order of Stalin. He signed all these documents. So it's one of the reasons is in the countries who share this or other kind of a terrible past. And also this decommunization process, which we help in this process government, because Ukraine and Georgian governments have had declared. Unfortunately, Belarus state is still under rule of Soviet period leader, and he even he is proud that he stops the communization process in his country. Let's go to the main challenges. First of all, I want to underline that legislative and general attitude of a state is one of the first and main challenges that works against us. And best situation in in this area is in Ukraine. They have adopted the relevant law in 2015, and the organization that collects these documents, they have received opportunities to digitize all the documents they were interested in. All the documents that former KGB archive is totally open there. Also, Ukraine is the only state in where they can go to a reading hall and use their own camera. For example, in Georgia, we advocate for to make according change in law, and government tells us, and in this case, archive will lose its income, and this income is also very ridiculous. For 1 year, it is like $6,000 or $7,000, which is okay. 2 minutes. Oh, sorry. Which is not that much to lose. In Belarus, CSO finds it difficult to, on contemporary repressions, to talk with victims and partner organizations that are reluctant to share it, and they threat constant challenges like threat of arrest, confiscations, including confiscation of all the documents and so on. So sorry, I missed the time, so I will go through my points, and then of course you can read the survey. We are so what we can say that this questionnaire was very useful. For example, we don't use entity relationship model. We don't use like a relationship between database. Yes, of course, our database and archival documents base is rather small today, but for the future, when we will develop it and we will add more and more documents, we will need it. And I think international experts and international advices in this field will be very useful. Regarding security protocols, I think that for Georgia and Ukraine, it is not the case, because we mainly interview victims of Soviet political regime, and it's not a big threat for them. There is no threat at all for them to challenge something. But for Belarusian organizations, they interview and they document modern day repressions. For them, of course, it's a big challenge, and they should cover their personal identities as well. This is shortly how our and Ukrainian document database looks at this moment. We plan to reorganize our website, which was developed 10 years ago, and it needs to be renovated. And in September, we will have a new website, or even before. And Ukrainian website, it's more attractive from outside view, I think. And I will go to quickly to conclusions. It is very interesting. Only one organization, Ukrainian organization, has developed and implemented different type of relevant methodologies, such as coding methods, information analysis, ways of tagging and creating relationships, etc. Cooperation and joint projects on the national as well as international level seems to have positively affected the development of the CSOs archives and their digitalization process. In Georgian case, if idea comes from foreign organization or donor organization, Georgian governmental archives, they are always happy to share with us documents. If it's not so, they are not very happy, and they ask, and they are not very cooperative in this. Apart from restrictions to financial and human resources affecting each of the organizations in 3 countries, the legislative and political situation in state seems to be affecting the way the CSOs approach, store, and develop their archival data. For example, in Ukraine, it's more easy and free. In Georgia, it's a little bit harder, and in Belarus, it's very hard enough. thank you, and we'll wait for your questions. Thank you very much.
Anton, muchas gracias por esa presentación.
Anton, thank you so much for your presentation. Very concise. And we now move on to Carlos Juarez from Guatemala, from the Mutual Support Group. He is the co-coordinator for the archive at that institution. If you could tell us, please, if you would, Carlos, about the general challenges that you have faced, that your organization has faced in creating your archives. And could you also address the matter of public access to sensitive documents? I know that you have engaged in that at the GAM, and I think it would be interesting to many other organizations who are joining us today. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. To begin, I will share the link to our website. I don't have a presentation per se, but you can at least take a look at the archive, and any comments you have on that are very welcome. To begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about the GAM. The GAM is an organization that seeks people who were forcefully disappeared during the internal armed conflict, as was very common in Latin America. And this was obviously very much driven by women, very similar to the story in Argentina and El Salvador, certain efforts in Peru as well. So the GAM was very similar to that as far as forced disappearances in Latin America. I think that the experience in Guatemala is very well known. The experience in Argentina is very well known, and the situation in Guatemala was also very similar. GAM began in July of 1984, and the armed conflict went from 1960 to 1996. With the creation of the GAM as one of the very first organizations from civil society that would denounce disappearances, the GAM received testimonials from victims who had disappeared from 1960 and went all the way through the conflict, because our files contain even claims from the year 2000. So despite the peace having been signed in 1996 together with a ceasefire, certain practices remained in place, such as forced disappearances and many other human rights violations that we have documented in our archive. So to address the matter of the challenges, I would tell you that one of the very first challenges that we faced was around creating the vision, the institutional vision, to recover and organize the archives. Unfortunately, Guatemala has a major debt when it comes to archives and archival documents in the country. There is no archiving culture in many organizations such as ours. And we believe that there are many organizations that have treasure troves of documents around the internal armed conflict that could be highly useful and helpful to organizations to clarify the events around human rights violations that were committed during the armed conflict in Guatemala. So first, that was the first challenge for us. That was a huge challenge, the challenge of being able to establish an institutional vision to recover those archives. We are a legal organization that has even boosted several cases at the inter-American level and at the international level and domestic level on transitional justice. However, given the situation, there was no way previously of storing the documents in an ideal fashion. And as in many cases, our archives were kept in a warehouse that was somewhat abandoned without the proper conditions for storage. At one point, we made the decision to move forward, but what was most important, to establish the archive as a future foundation for institutional work that had not been addressed previously. And for that, we had much help via the Guatemalan National Police Archive organization that helped us greatly. This is around 2015 that I'm talking about. And as it is today, some of the figures that we have show that, well, we have 100 meters of linear information as far as the documents. And of those 100 linear meters, we have been able to archive 16 of those 100 meters. Of those 16 meters, 8.5 meters have been digitized and made available to researchers and to victims. So the situation currently is that, well, I think that one of the main challenges there is also about having that vision about what an archive might mean to the future. You have to understand the country's context. It's quite complicated these days when it comes to human rights. And so we're faced with that vision, where the first vision we had was actually to support legal proceedings. We had unrestricted access to the public ministry's archives, especially under the Office of Human Rights. But in our vision, the archive is simply a tool that allows for establishing memory for the future and to take the archive into new generations. To us, the archive will be a tool so that researchers and artists and students become inspired and learn about the history of Guatemala based on these documents. Something that is quite valuable from the GOM's documents is that they contain the view of the victims. And in that sense, our documents hold information on perpetrators, state perpetrators, as well as guerrilla perpetrators. So that makes it so that the documents have these direct perspectives from the victims themselves, which are often supplemented by the police archives, the National Police Archives. So that is an important input for legal proceedings, legal investigations. So we understand very clearly that the perpetrators are dying off, and it's increasingly difficult to have the victims have access to justice in that sense. What's going to happen with the memories of these victims? They cannot just be left in the past, so it's important to preserve those. However, well, obviously, as we have heard here today, sustainability is one of the main issues when working archives. To us, it was very important to understand that we could not do this on our own. We did need partnerships, and we did need organizations who could help us to maintain the archive. Fortunately, after the first 3 years of working with the archive, we were able to establish a partnership with Harvard University in Philadelphia to obtain the digitization software for the documents. 3,700 cases have been digitized and put in a database. And now, and really the main challenge was around the ethical aspects with the university. The university wanted to publish everything, and we had information that was so sensitive. I mean, we had information about perpetrators who are still coexisting in the communities with the victims. So we could not have unlimited access be given to that information. That was a huge challenge in maintaining these aspects and in talking about these things with the university. And we finally came to an agreement. We approached the 25 families of whom we have the most information in the archive, and we did communicate what we wanted to do with them and whether or not they were interested in making their information public, and only 8 of those families agreed. So our current access consists of 8 public cases that are limited to the website with all the respective documents. Some cases have just 1 document, some cases have 20, 30, 50 documents, but at all times we observe the secret aspect, the private aspect of these files. We could not expose people in a way that might cause any harm. So you have to keep in mind that despite everything, trials are still ongoing in Guatemala, but also threats are still ongoing in Guatemala, and they've actually been increasing. So people do have a certain fear of being persecuted, so we could not expose people in that sense. So I think the experience has actually been quite positive with the university. It's the university that is keeping the backup repository at the university, and we have the other. So that has also given us some security for the archive in case there's any kind of attack. But we have also been looking at access, and unfortunately, only researchers from abroad have been interested in the archive as such. Our main challenge is to provide access to the archive for Guatemalan use, for the victims' use, for the students' use. The university, I mean, we try and sustain the archive by bringing in students in Guatemala to work on them. Unfortunately, archival work is somewhat complicated these days, but we have managed to have foreign universities gain interest in our archive and become involved even via their students in our archival work. And that's why certain research has been done with our archive. And just to conclude, I would provide one thought on access by saying to us, there's two types of access. There's direct access by researchers and others who are interested in the matter. But then there's also a triggered access, so to speak, so that new generations that are so digital also are interested in learning about the archive. In our experience, in addition to the documents, we have converted some of that information into certain products that are then disseminated over social networks. Our idea is to involve students in graphic design, for example, to transform this information into something that can create awareness in the newer generations as far as the victims. We want to have people studying literature who might become inspired by the archives and create poetry and literature, and drama students who might maybe create a play based on the information in the archives too. So that also that is also important in sustainability. We cannot permanently request financing for something that might be difficult to maintain after the fact. So my advice, my proposal to you, just from my very humble opinion, is that your partnerships and outlook has to be broad when thinking about sustainability for the archive. It has to be sustainable for and attractive for the people that we want to change the discourse on human rights. And we want to make it attractive. We want to make the archive attractive to all the people who are researching and going through the documents. So in our experience, partnerships. And also, we do want to export this experience to many other archives in Guatemala and in the world who are still in the early stages of just thinking about and assessing the archive. It's important that you have a comprehensive outlook as far as what you want to do and think about sustainability from the very beginning, which will be always key. We believe that, well, our experience has been quite important to us, and we have received an archive from other organizations. We had one organization give us their archive, in fact, because they saw our success story and wanted us to take over. We, after that, in fact, received 5 more requests, but our space is quite limited. So we do think that it's important that you communicate your success stories on archival work so that other institutions and organizations that want to preserve their information can start on that same path for archival work together with everyone. I saw Mark's sign, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up here. I thank you for this time, and I'm open to any questions you might have or any observations too. Thank you so much, Carlos. Thanks also to Juliana and Anton for having shared your experiences from your various regions in the world. I would like to now open up the floor somewhat for questions and to continue in this discussion that began after the break in terms of the various experiences in various parts of the world. Keeping in mind that there are organizations joining us today that do have physical archives and that have not yet gone into the stage of digitization. So I would like to provide this time to have everyone ask their questions and leverage the information from the panelists that are joining us today. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and raise your hand, either physically or using the raise hand button.
¿Alguna pregunta sobre el tema
Any
de la
questions about public access to archives on human rights violations?
Yo quizás podría empezar esta
Maybe I could begin the discussion with one question for Carlos.
¿Cuáles son los niveles de acceso
What are the various levels of access
un investigador que sea
for a researcher, be they foreign or be they nationals in Guatemala, when accessing the documents in the archive, and what kind of follow-up does the GAM do in terms of that information,
publicarse en algún momento?
if it is published at any point?
Sí, Mark, muchas gracias.
Yes, Mark, thank you for that. Currently, we are only providing access via an online procedure because of the pandemic, and also to better safeguard the documents. So the process that we've established is one where if someone would like to access the database, they must complete a form where they commit to making responsible use of the information. But in addition to that, if they do any research or if they would like to publish anything, they must first share it with the GAM so that the GAM can do a proper analysis on the kind of information that is being published to make sure that the victim's safety is not compromised. We have had some experience in that sense where we have had to ask certain documents that certain documents not be published and that they be kept online. But again, and I can tell you the stories here. Here, it's really just two of us who are managing the archive. We join efforts in that sense, but it is an issue because what if, for example, we had 6 researchers who are sending 6 requests at the same time in different languages? I mean, there we would really have to take some time to go through everything that would be published and accessed, and then provide observations to that. So our main challenge really lies in trying to work with the families who own the information, really. Because what we're trying to do is undertake a campaign where we can have people look up even their own information. And in case they do find information in the GAM, they can then determine whether or not that information should be limited for web users only or under any other kind of limitations. So our main challenge really is working with the families, because we did have a discussion on access when it's data based on public files. As per information laws in Guatemala, public files cannot be restricted in any way, and when it comes to human rights. In the case of the GAM, it's a private archive, so we can very easily say, well, we have no obligation to make any of this public. But then why have the archive? So the main issue is around the family, the safeguarding of information for the family's sake. It's increasingly important that the archive constantly engage with the families whose information might be published at one point. So what we want to do is make sure that our engagement with families is increasingly strong so that they can assess the information and decide what documents they would like to make public so that people can then make use of those documents with no restrictions. Thank you, Carlos. Anton, Juliana. In your regions, public access issues, Anton, I understand that your files are public, and Juliana, in your case, you have information that's been gathered from newspaper clippings and newspaper information, so that's public. But in your personal experience, what have been some of the challenges in terms of disseminating the information contained in the archives?
Maybe you can start. Yeah, so CELS keeps different kinds of records. So I spoke of police brutality incidents, but we also keep records related to the dictatorship. And those are not obviously published in the newspapers. We keep testimonies and other material that relates to what Carlos was saying. And some of that is reserved. But relating to the archive on police violence, I think that one of the main challenges has been getting to digitalize everything in a format that is suitable and that is accessible and that we can host in a platform. So we began the digitalizing process, and then we realized we weren't doing it correctly. So I don't know how to explain this, but we kept photocopies of the newspapers. Those were in like folders, like Carlos was saying, not in proper archival conditions. And so they were getting ruined. And right now we have very big PDFs with a lot of cases in one file. And that is obviously not very accessible. So I think that we still haven't managed to organize all of that. And that is one of the main obstacles for getting people to actually use, like Carlos was saying, these archives. And we have different ideas. We have produced other audiovisual material and websites with other archives, and we would like to do the same with this one. But I think that one of the obstacles has to do with how we keep it and in what time do we manage to digitalize it, but also, like Carlos was saying before, what do we want to use it for? I think that those are things that for other NGOs that are also going through digitalization processes that you have to keep in mind before starting the process. So to set your guidelines, how are you going to name the files? How are you going to store the files? Where and why? And to have really clear decisions before setting out to do it, and what do you want to do with it? Because I think that changes the way that you effectively approach this process.
Gracias, Juliana. Anton,
Thank you, Juliana. Anton, maybe some thoughts to conclude the matter of public access?
Yes, of course. Thank you. And I was waiting for this conference and panel because our idea, what I spoke about, let me share a screen once again. So now you can see our tool of assessment of openness of state archives in different countries. It looks like this and covers covers Eastern Bloc and former Soviet countries. It has its methodology and full documents that should participants of this project fill, and then we provide this kind of rating. And I think we will offer them to Sarah and to Coalition to include countries and today's participants as well, from Guatemala, Argentina, South Africa, for example, and other countries which went under this dictatorship regimes and which have regime archives. And I think we should extend this our project, and it will be very useful for the project as well for countries.
OpenArchives.org is an
we have here explanation of how this website works, and I think we have to talk about this for the future. And unfortunately, the limitation, one of the limitation was COVID-19 situation, because in this our ranking we have, for example, reading hall, which will decrease overall ranking of archives. But we can also negotiate relating this, and we can put out reading hall section for this time because of the coronavirus situation. So I think for future development it will be very useful to see how countries in other region, not only in former Soviet countries, work. So here is a particular assessment of particular countries, for example Armenia. Then here is information about state archives, and also we have assessments here, full assessments, which you can sorry, some problem, I think. Yeah, here as well. We will fix it, and which you can download then and find out which country has here is, I think here we can open, yeah, here are PDFs for this, and this is a full assessment. It is a methodology, and we can talk about methodology as well. So here are already indicators and answers, and each indicator had its social importance index. Some of the questions are more important than other. So I think it's very easy to use. And besides this, with this sign-in button, we have already created an online evaluation form. So evaluators just need to point the right questions, and the program then itself calculates final outcome. So it's our offer, and I will contact Sarah after tomorrow, next week on Monday, because I know now you have a very harsh work to organize conference. I know how it's hard to organize conferences, and after this, I think we can talk about this to involve more countries. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Anton.
Thank you so much, Anton. We will now then move on to the next section, but I would like to read one message from Floridalma Gonzalez from Guatemala, from Oxlachuc. She says that I agree with everything that's been said. People are the owners of their testimonials and documents, and it's very true that they should provide their authorization so that they can be used, digitized, and made public. So with this final thought, I would give the floor once again to Sarah so that we can continue with the plenary session. Thank you so much, Anton, Carlos, Juliana, for having participated today in this panel.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for facilitating this instructive conversation. Thank you as well to Juliana, to Anton, and to Carlos for all of your contributions. Since we don't have a lot of time remaining, I'd like to suggest if there are any questions that weren't answered as part of the previous session, we can continue with those, as well as any inputs that other participants would like to share. I did notice, I think, Yvonne, you had a question in the chat that I wasn't sure if that was answered. If you would perhaps like to share that with the group.
Would you like me to state it, or?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm asking because this is something that we've had to deal with ourselves and have maybe dealt with, maybe not perfectly, but imperfectly. I would just wanted to ask Carlos if he has concerns about, on the Haverford side, them being, like, not by choice, but being compelled to provide access to the closed records of those families, like because of a legal subpoena or a government request coming, you know, from a foreign government to the US government. This has happened in the United States. And what your thoughts on how that can be addressed in these kinds of partnerships.
Thank you, Yvonne. And Carlos, do you have any thoughts in response to that question?
Sí, seguro.
Yes, of course.
Nosotros lo que hemos hecho
What we have done
hemos
is
firmado un convenio
we have signed an agreement with Haverford University stating the guidelines to our relationship. And one of the very first principles that we set forth in that agreement is that there must be respect for the owners of for the information ownership and people's private lives. And as long as the sources of the information do not authorize it, no one can share the information. No names can be mentioned. And this agreement is renewed every 2 years. We are going on our second year now. So if there have been any negative experiences, they are worked out, they are negotiated, and the relationship is renewed every 2 years so that everything is much more respectful, let's say, of what was agreed on. What we have had happen is, for example, we have had students research the experience, not using specific data, but really look at the experience as a whole. So that's been quite healthy in that sense, because it does show us that the use being given to the archive has been based on what has been agreed on with the university initially.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Yvonne, for the question. I'd like to give an opportunity. We have about 5 more minutes for the remainder of our plenary discussion. So I'd like to invite, in particular, if there are any organizations here that are perhaps earlier in the process of digital archiving or in the process of digitizing their documents, I'd be curious to hear from all of you if the challenges that were described, particularly in this last panel, have resonated with your own experience, or if perhaps there are issues or difficulties you're facing that haven't been mentioned so far. I think that would be very interesting for all of us to hear, particularly as we mentioned on the first day, all of the Global Initiative for Justice, Truth, and Reconciliation partners will be using the research from this phase of the project to create a manual on digital archiving. I see Suleiman Ba, you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Bonjour, comment allez-vous? Je suis Suleiman Ba.
Good morning, how are you?
La Coalition nationale d'appui à la réconciliation en Guinée. Je vous remercie tous. Les présentations qui ont été faites vraiment sont...
I would like to thank you for the presentations which you made. They were really wonderful. But this is the issue we have in Guinea. This has been since 1958 when we got independence. The archives are scattered and very difficult to localize, to find, especially archive of the Kambwaro. When it was destroyed along with the archives. So in order to reconstitute it, it's a great issue. I would like to know those who have the skills, especially people from Argentina or Cameltech, who also faced so many challenges and experienced so much violence, how did they manage to reconstitute this archive? How do you gather the archive in order to digitalize them? This is a great issue that we have in Guinea. Thank you.
Thank you, Suleiman. I think that's an excellent question. How do you begin this process when the documents are dating back multiple decades? I don't know if any of our panelists from today or partners would like to respond. Perhaps, Juliana, is there maybe an experience you could share from Argentina?
Yes, thank you for your question. Obviously, a problem that resonates very much with the issues we face in Argentina. And I think that there were many organizations in Argentina that worked together to restore and to try to find testimonies and documentation as to locations or perpetrators, and try to check the information between these archives so as to identify people, places, and events. We also started litigation processes and advocacy processes with the state and its three powers, with the legislative and the judicial, to get the state to reveal these archives, some of which have been classified. And this is something that is still ongoing. There are working roundtables with prominent human rights organizations. We take part in those spaces, and we urge the government to release this information. And there's a lot of political support for this to happen. In Argentina, the human rights movement is very strong and very solid. So I think that, like was also said before, building networks to try to push for the state to reveal this information, to declassify this information, is central, and to try to establish ongoing and continuous processes that will last for many years even, so as to support the justice processes, not something that is one moment or one type of information that is declassified, but the Argentinian government also worked and asked for other countries to reveal the information that they kept about the terrorists in Argentina, the state terrorism in Argentina, including the United States and the CIA, the FBI, etc., but also other Latin American countries. And I think that is accomplished by pressure and a lot of work and a lot of networking. So we are also very available to keep exchanging and to answer any of other further questions that you may have, or that anything that we could do to help.
Thank you very much, Juliana. It's not a short-term process, I don't think at all. So I don't know, Carlos or Anton, if there's anything you'd like to add from your experience. No. Oh yes, Carlos, please go ahead.
Creo que es un proceso que
Yes, thank you. I
obedece a
think it's a
varios
process
factores.
that does involve several
En el
stakeholders.
caso
In the
de nuestra
case
experiencia,
of
es
our
debido a
experience,
un archivo eminentemente
our archive is strictly private, but I think our struggle in Guatemala has been found in many organizations trying to access government documents. I would go back to the issue that we have in Guatemala when it comes to archives, because we do have a public information law in place, but we have no archiving law in place. And that has caused a lot of harm a lot of damage when it comes to public access to information in this country because there are no tools available, nor is there any vision around maintaining archives. So it begins by not recognizing the work of those who maintain archives, and it continues in not understanding how archives need to be maintained. And information can be really affected here. And if we think about the victims of human rights violations, it directly involves them. It directly involves access to justice. So if there are no legislative tools that allow the victims to access justice, well, then the efforts have to be led by civil society. The organizations have a lot of experience here throughout Latin America. And I would even point out the case of Honduras in that regard. Honduras is the very first case of forced disappearances that was taken to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And that created a legal precedent for all of Latin America in that sense. So efforts are definitely driven by civil society in countries where access to these documents is very difficult. All we have to do is continue in these meetings, such as the meeting today, to continue in these efforts and make them materialize.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I'll give one last call if anyone has a final question before I hand it over to my colleague to do the closing today. Are there any final questions from anyone? I don't see any hands, so I would just like to say thank you once again to Mark and to Farina for facilitating today's panel discussions, and to all of our panelists. I think the point that we have continually come to is the importance of exchanging experiences and of establishing these networks for solidarity and support. So that's one reason why we're all so grateful you could join us today. So with that, I'll hand things over to my colleague Bojidar, who's going to close the session for today.